Welcome back to another Forza Horizon 5 tech video. Today I'm testing 9 low-end video cards to see if we can get them to play 60 FPS at 1080p or close to it. The cards are on screen now. The 2GB cards are Nvidia 660, 660 Ti, 680, 760, 960, and the AMD R9380, the 3GB Nvidia 780, and the 4GB Nvidia 1050 Ti and 1650. Remember, if you find this video helpful, consider hitting the like and subscribe button. A few things to note. Most of these GPUs, except for the 1050 Ti and the 1650, are considered unsupported cards by the game, and you'll probably get the unsupported card or driver message when you start the game. And you're going to encounter the low memory message in game, but you can still run the game. You're also going to want 16GB of system RAM if you can, because all of these 2GB VRAM cards are below the minimum memory specs, so they use Windows shared GPU memory, which is fine so long as you have enough system RAM to allow this. If you want to know more about shared GPU memory, I made a video on this. I'll leave the link for that video in the description. If you're only running 8GB of system RAM, your results with these cards may vary. These GPUs may be old, but there's still a lot of them out there, and you can play the game with most of them. The testing's done using the following 3 methods. First, a run through of the game's official benchmark. I've said in a previous video that I felt the in-game benchmark was limited and didn't fully stress the cards. Well, I was completely wrong about this. The in-game benchmark is going to give you a worse result than pretty much any area in-game when you're playing. For example, you can get 40 FPS in the benchmark, but still be able to run most areas of the map at a solid 55-60 FPS. So don't always look at the benchmark as the final result of how your game will run if you get a low result. Second, race 1. This is a race done using auto drive through the forest/beach/small town area. And third, call it race 2. This race is done through the desert with some far distance viewing involved and a drive through one of the festivals, which generally drops the FPS a bit. The test system is an i7-9700K with 16GB at 3200 MHz DDR4 RAM. All games will run at 1080p. Race 1 is always on the left side of the screen and race 2 is always on the right side of the screen when they're split. The graphics settings profiles in order of lowest to highest are very low, low, medium, high, ultra, and extreme. All tests were done using these profiles, no other tweaking was done. This system spec's probably higher than what most people who own these cards are going to have, but it pushes the GPU to its limits and shows what it's capable of. So your FPS might vary a little if you have a lower spec CPU and RAM. Starting with the GTX 660 2GB card, this card gets a score of 36 FPS on very low in the benchmark. You can see we're using more VRAM than the card has available, so we're going to be using Windows shared GPU memory. Onto the race 1 and race 2 benchmarks, you can see on very low that the game really doesn't look that great. And if we look at the numbers at the end of this benchmark, we can see that this card struggles to get 60 FPS in either race. The average on race 1 is 43 FPS, with the 1% low being 34. The average on race 2 is 49 FPS, with the 1% low being 35. So the summary for this card is that even at 1080p very low, the game is going to struggle to hit 60 FPS. If it's all you have, then you could try 720p resolution to get more FPS, but I'm going to give this card a fail for 1080p 60. Next up, the GTX 660 Ti 2GB. This card gets a score of 47 FPS on very low in the benchmark. We're also using more VRAM than the card has, so Windows shared GPU memory will be kicking in, which is the case for most of these cards. On to race 1 and race 2 benchmarks. The average on race 1 is 57 FPS, with the 1% low being 46. The average on race 2 is 58 FPS, with the 1% low being 49. There's no point testing any higher with this card because we've found the spot we can push 60 FPS. So this card is yes, you can get very close to 1080p 60 FPS in game on very low. Things will probably dip in the city areas, but overall it should be fairly playable. Next up, the GTX 680 2GB. This card gets a score of 52 FPS on very low in the benchmark. The average on race 1 is 58 FPS, with the 1% low being 48. The average on race 2 is 59 FPS, with the 1% low being 53. Let's run this card on the low profile as well and see if it can hold 60. We get 41 FPS in the benchmark when set to low. The average on race 1 drops to 49 FPS with the 1% being 39. The average on race 2 drops to 53 FPS with the 1% being 41. So in order to run this card at 1080p 60, you're going to need to use the very low profile setting. You could run the game at low and it seems to average around 50 FPS, but that'll be up to you if you're happy to run it at that FPS. Next up, the GTX 760 2GB. This card gets a score of 32 FPS on very low in the benchmark. It's not a very good result for the 760. In race 1 and 2, the average on race 1 is 48 FPS with the 1% low being 35, and the average in race 2 is 52 FPS with the 1% low being 39. We don't manage to get 1080p 60 with this card, even on the very low settings. It's still playable at very low, it's just going to experience a lot of frame dips, and it's probably not going to be the best experience. Next up, the GTX 780 3GB. This card gets a score of 54 FPS on very low in the benchmark. It's the only 3GB card of the bunch. The average on race 1 is 60 FPS with the 1% low being 54. The average on race 2 is 60 FPS with the 1% low being 58. This card could definitely run the game at 1080p 60 FPS on very low. Let's push it up to low. Low gets 46 FPS in the benchmark. The average on race 1 is 55 FPS with the 1% low being 45, and the average on race 2 is 57 FPS with the 1% low being 48. It's very close to 60 FPS on low. I'm going to say this card can run the game at 1080p 60 or very close enough that it's going to be playable and should only give you a minimal slowdown in the city. Next up, the GTX 960 2GB. We skip very low on this card as it has more than enough power to play the game at that detail, and we get a score of 49 FPS in the benchmark on low. The average on race 1 is 59 FPS with the 1% low being 50. The average on race 2 is 59 FPS with the 1% low being 53. The performance on this game at low is acceptable enough to say it can run 1080p 60 FPS. You'll just get some minor slowdowns at times, but overall 60 FPS is fine. Moving up to the medium graphics profile, we get 41 FPS in the benchmark. And the average on race 1 is 52 FPS with the 1% low being 42. The average on race 2 is 53 FPS with the 1% low being 40. For 1080p 60 FPS gaming, you're going to want to set this game to the low graphics profile. You can try medium, but it might get unacceptably low FPS in some areas of the game. It comes close, but it just might not quite be enough. Next up, the only AMD card in the test, the 2GB R9380. Skipping very low and going straight to the low graphics profile, this card gets 50 FPS on the benchmark. The average on race 1 is 60 FPS with the 1% low being 48, and the average on race 2 is 60 FPS with the 1% low being 48. Stepping up to the medium graphics profile, we see 41 FPS in the benchmark, and the average on race 1 is 48 FPS with the 1% low being 38. The average on race 2 is 52 FPS with the 1% low being 39. So you can definitely play on low at 1080p 60. Moving up to medium, when we see the races average around 50 FPS, it's probably a bit low to say we can play it at 1080p 60. Onto the 4GB cards now, the GTX 1050 Ti. We skip very low and low because this card will run the game at 1080p 60 on both of those settings. And the first one we look at is medium. We manage 55 FPS in the benchmark on medium, and the average on race 1 is 60 FPS with the 1% low being 53. The average on race 2 is 59 FPS with the 1% low being 53. It's safe to say this card can handle medium 1080p 60 FPS. On high, we get 48 FPS in the benchmark, and the average on race 1 is 55 FPS with the 1% low being 47. The average on race 2 is 56 FPS with the 1% low being 46. So 1080p 60 is definitely capable on medium. Moving up to high, and we do see some drops from 60 FPS, hovering around 55 on the two races. I'd say play on medium for a smooth experience, but definitely try it on high to see if you're happy with it because it comes very close to 60 FPS. And in a lot of areas, you will get 60 FPS solid. Last but not least, the 4GB GTX 1650. I'll jump straight to the high profile for this card because everything lower than that runs at 1080p 60. We get 59 FPS in the benchmark on high. The average for race 1 is 60 with 55 for the 1% lows. The average on race 2 is 60 FPS with the 1% low being 55. So we can clearly run it at 1080p 60 on high. Setting the graphics up to ultra, this card takes a big performance hit. It goes from 60 FPS on high to 34 FPS on ultra in the benchmark. Almost a 50% performance hit. The average on race 1 is 42 FPS with the 1% low being 33. The average on race 2 is 45 with the 1% low being 33. So it's safe to say that if you have a 1650, it plays 1080p 60 FPS on high with ease, jumping up to ultra, and it really takes a big performance hit and doesn't come close to 60. So there you have it. I'll leave the summary on screen now for those of you who are going to hit the subscribe and the like button, because I've put all this info into a nice, easy to read screen with a clickable timestamp, so you can skip the entire video just to come to this page to get the info you want. Yes, I did that just for you guys. Hopefully this video has been useful to some people. Maybe you have one of these cards and aren't sure if it'll run the game or not. Well, if you do own one of these cards, this video at least helps to show you how it runs. Happy Forza Horizon 5ing everyone. Until next time.